So since I made those videos yesterday about investing and treasure in heaven, I've had a bit of time to think some more about this. And as I was thinking about this morning, I started looking at some scriptures in regards to this idea of treasure in heaven and what is this actually talking about here? Because, in terms of coming up with my criteria for investing, I came up with some things like it should grow. The overall capital should grow, and it should help with human thriving. That it should be helpful for people, and that it should store up treasure in heaven. And I haven't done an exhaustive search necessarily, but in what some of my kind of initial quick research showed was that treasure in heaven was typically, the way that Jesus talked about it was typically in the context of giving to the needy. So in the case of the rich young ruler, Jesus was like, sell all that you've got and give to the poor and come follow me and you'll have treasure in heaven, something like that. And there was another, I want to say there was at least one other, of course with all the Gospels there's multiple, right? But with one other separate instance, I believe, where Jesus spoke about, well, I guess in Matthew 6, where it talks about not storing up treasure on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt, but where thieves. No, wait, maybe that's not the case where, I think there was a separate instance where it talked about giving to the poor or giving to the needy as being the way that you store up treasure in heaven. Now that's kind of interesting because I had traditionally thought more in terms of the way you store up treasure in heaven was by, evangelism or helping people to go to heaven as being the way of storing up treasure in heaven, because people say you can't take it with you and all that, right? And it's the people, right, that you'll experience for eternity if you're able to bring them to heaven to be with you. And but it's interesting that initially my research indicates that you can give money to poor people and that will translate into treasures in heaven. Now think about that. How long are you going to be in heaven versus how long are you going to be here on the earth, right? Like it doesn't even really jibe, because it's so, the idea of forever is like hard even to fathom as a human. So are you telling me that by giving here on the earth that I could actually be richer in heaven? Pretty crazy stuff to think about. You don't necessarily think about your money being having quite those kind of practical ramifications for heaven. It's like, okay, I could have a retirement account here, and I could save up, and it could be for me, my wife, family, whatever, right? But it could last until I'm, let's say I die at 90, okay? So until I'm 90, that retirement account could be extremely useful. It'd help me to live, it'd allow me to give and whatever, but it could be very useful until about 90. Now I'm about 40, so that's about 50 years. However, in about 60 years from now, potentially, so let's say I'm gone by the time I'm 100. In 60 years from now, I'm potentially getting a return on that investment. And 60 years is a long time, but it's not like just a vague, nebulous never land, right? Like, it's fairly concrete to think about. Now, maybe it's not really years up in heaven, but you get the idea that 60 years as measured from an earthling's perspective, that money could be paying off. Now, I don't know how treasure in heaven works. I've got a lot of questions, I guess, about that treasure in heaven. Like, does it keep multiplying in heaven too? Do you get compound interest in heaven? Is it just kind of there? What do you do with this treasure? Can you enjoy it and have fun with it? Can you buy stuff? Do you Is it just something else to like throw at Jesus' feet and like in awe and just like enjoy it as an act of worship. I don't know what that treasure does, but I mean, heaven already sounds cool. And you're telling me I can be, I don't know, stockpiling is quite the right word, but I can be stashing treasure up there before I even get there. I mean, that sounds pretty cool, honestly. Now, you could say, well, in that case, I have to make as much money as possible here so that I can give as much money as possible so that my treasure in heaven will be as large as possible. But Jesus did clarify. He did make a point. Now, he maybe didn't speak specifically to the storing treasure in heaven in this passage, but in the case of the widow's mite, which, if you're wondering, we're not talking about insects, we're talking about coins. The case of the widow's pennies, essentially, Jesus was essentially saying that the investment is based on the sacrifice, not on the quantity. So if that applies to treasure in heaven, that means that just because I was, like, let's say if I was born a Rockefeller, it doesn't mean that I can automatically just have more treasure in heaven than somebody else. Or if I was born, a Gates or a Bezos kid or something like that. But rather that it's actually, in a sense, you could say it's actually equally open to everyone to make contributions to their heavenly retirement account. And they can, so it doesn't matter how much money you have. It's really a level playing field. And so the only limitation, essentially, to how much treasure you can store in heaven is to how much you're willing to sacrifice here on earth. So, people talk about living like no one else is willing to, so you can live like no one else can, later. It's this idea of like really scrimping so that later in life you can enjoy the fruits of your skimping. But this takes it to a whole new level, to think that in theory you could actually skimp throughout your entire life. And I'm not saying that's what God intends, but that's a possibility, is to live in a very thrifty manner your entire life so as to maximize your ability to have treasure in heaven. So anyway, pretty interesting stuff. Interesting that, first of all, we can store up treasure in heaven. Secondly, that it's linked directly to earthly finances. That it's not just some sort of vague sense of like just sort of do generally good in the world and that somehow translates into treasures in heaven, but that actually the way you spend your money here does equal treasure in heaven. And thirdly, that it's in the context primarily of giving to the needy is the exact way that you can store up treasure in heaven. So anyway, hope you enjoyed thinking about this as much as I did.